Hi there. Welcome back to Tuesday's Tips. I'm Greg Kaiser, and for those of you that have joined me since the beginning or relatively close to that, you know that we've been dealing mostly with Lightroom, post processing, image editing, and that sort of thing. And I want to kind of break away from that because I think I've pretty much covered everything that I want to as far as the overall aspect of Lightroom. There'll be some things that I'll get into later on as I come up to them in my own post-processing, but I wanted to start something a little bit different with Tuesday's Tips and just kind of make it a conversation with you. This first one, I want to talk about, it's a list, and I know it's kind of clickbaity, and I apologize for that, but this is something that I think is going to benefit a lot of photographers that might be starting out, and things that I'm glad that I heard at some point along the line before I really got too in-depth into photography. So these are going to be the 5 top tips that benefited me starting out, and I hope it's something that will open up some doors for you or perhaps give you a little bit different of a direction that might make things a little bit easier for you. So the first thing I want to talk about is probably one of the things that got me into photography to start with, and that's actually being introduced to the technical side early on. Now, I was in one of those families where my mom would take the rangefinder camera, the old film thing, the Instamatic, and she'd point, click, and that was it. There wasn't any real thought to it, and most of the time her pictures turned out like this because I think the cropping from the photo lab and just how she framed the pictures with the camera that she was using, she ended up chopping the tops of all of our heads off. It became a family joke, and we all had a lot of fun with it. But that was one aspect of how I learned what photography was. Another aspect was at the holidays, all the family would get together and it would be a strobe light show because everybody had the little flash cubes on top of their Instamatic cameras. And we would take pictures of each other taking pictures of taking pictures. So there was a whole lot of just flashes going on in the room, and we were just taking pictures of each other taking pictures. So none of that was necessarily what I would consider serious photography. So there wasn't that draw for me to get into photography in a real creative sense. However, on the other side of my family, we had my dad. And one of the things that I remember from childhood, and by childhood I'm talking about when I was probably 5 to maybe 10 years old, so a long, long time ago, he had gotten, it was actually this camera right here, old Konica. And I remember thinking this was the biggest thing I had ever seen because all the cameras that I had seen before this were maybe a third of the size and had the little rotating flash cube on top. But this was my first experience with a camera that actually had all these little controls and dials and numbers. And I mean, even something as simple as a removable lens. I mean, come on. That spoke to me because one of the things that really appealed to me as a kid was working with my hands and doing things and learning kind of how things worked. I was that little goofy, geeky kid that built plastic models, stayed up in my room, and I would work on the little detail things, and I would be really interested in how things like this worked. So all through being a child, I wanted a camera like that. I knew nothing about photography, but I knew that there was more to it than just pointing and shooting, and that part interested me. So that was one of the first things that really benefited my time as being a photographer, was just being exposed to an SLR camera with the dials and knowing that there was a certain amount of technique involved. And I remember my dad going through things like changing the shutter speed, working with night films, higher ASA ratings, and things like that, wanting to get into using polarizing filters, wanting to get a telephoto lens. All of these things resonated with me and led me kind of down the path that, well, we're here today. So the second thing that I think is a very beneficial thing, and this is probably going to be more beneficial to others than the first tip, but I learned early on because I didn't have the benefit of learning through Facebook. There was really no Facebook when I started photography. It was kind of still almost MySpace. Uh, but I didn't have influencers showing me how to do things. What I ended up doing was reading books. And I was reading books specifically for landscape photography because that's what I wanted to get into. One of the themes that I kept coming across was a tripod is very beneficial. And this is something I hadn't even considered or thought about as I was considering taking up photography, but the more I read about a tripod, the more it made sense. With landscape photography, you want an extreme depth of field, which usually means you're stopping the lens down, which means limited light coming into the camera. So you need to steady the camera. And in most situations, the landscape is not something that's moving, so we can do that. So I kept reading that a tripod is important, and I went out and I got the cheap tripod, and well, I learned quickly, buy it correctly once and you don't have to keep buying it again, because I bought several cheap tripods. They all broke on me in very short order, and it wasn't until I finally broke down and got my first Manfrotto tripod, which never ever failed me, and it was pretty much a one-time expense, and it was done, whereas I spent probably twice that on cheap tripods over the first few years of learning. But what tripods have allowed me to do, not only to stop down the lens, but also to really fine-tune my compositions and to be able to repeat compositions as light changes, as clouds change, as certain elements enter or exit a frame. So shooting with a tripod has been one of those defining things in my photography, and had I not read about the need of a tripod for landscape photography early on, had I not adopted it early on, it would be a very hard technique to bring into photography after the fact. The fact that the first time I took a real camera out, which was a Sony f828 for those that know, from back in the early 2000s, the first time I went out with that camera, I had it on a tripod. So everything that I learned in photography was based on using a tripod. So it's second nature to me. It's almost as important to my process as putting the lens on the camera. So I want to make sure that everybody knows that a tripod is beneficial for more than just countering a shutter speed. We have image stabilization in body, the lenses, everything. We can get 8-9 stops of image stabilization. Now, a tripod is not necessarily even required for a 1-second exposure, but what it does for the creativity of the photographer is immeasurable, because it allows you to make fine tunings in that composition rather than you take the camera, you find your composition, you shoot it, you look on the LCD, say, oh, I should have changed this. Now you have to go back and get that exact composition back again to make the changes. With a tripod, so much easier. You just make the adjustments and every shot gets better. So that's my second tip. Tripod, very necessary for more than just landscape photos, in my opinion. Now the third tip is one that I got after I had been in photography for a while, and if you'll remember, I got into this as a landscape photographer because, hey, landscape photography is easy. Okay, all right, bonus tip. Landscape photography is not easy. It is one of the more demanding and one that will break you down types of photography, because the failures can be epic. The successes can be wonderful, but it depends on so many different things. So landscape photography is not easy, so that's a bonus tip. But I did start off thinking that landscape photography was just the natural state, whether it be trees, mountains, waterfalls. Hand of man essentially couldn't be involved. And while there is still a case to be made for that, it becomes a little bit more difficult to see that happen in reality in today's world. And it wasn't until I picked up this book from Harold Davis, Creative Landscapes. If I remember, I'll put a link in the description. But I picked this up sometime after 2013. So I had been a photographer for a while and had dabbled in things outside of just absolute pure landscape photography. But one of the chapters in this book talks about landscape in the modern world. And I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but it does kind of boil down to this basic idea. And I've got a note here. I'm just going to read this. It's a whole lot quicker than the chapter. But Harold Davis says, at its core, landscape photography is a genre that is used to show spaces within the world, ranging from the tiny to the vast. This romantic point of view essentially equates landscape and nature photography to be free of reference to humanity. But how much sense does that really make in the modern world? A modern view of the landscape pretty much has to include some sense of people and their artifacts. That last little bit there, that the modern landscape has to include some sense of people and their artifacts. Yeah, absolutely. The more I think about this, the more it is really common sense. But I needed to read that. I needed to see that somewhere else to break away from my thought that landscape photography had to be out in the middle of nowhere. You know, whether it's Death Valley, the mountains of North Carolina with nothing on the ridges, we have to have some semblance of humanity in our pictures at this point, or at least be open to that. It may be a fence, it may be, heaven forbid, a power line or power pole, might be a house, it might be a bridge, but these things start to develop their own landscapes. I started to be able to photograph barns in country settings, still do it as a landscape photographer, but I had the hand of man, I had a subject that I could treat as the star of my picture and let the landscape become secondary. And it opened up a huge, wide world for me as a photographer. And this tip kind of leads into a fourth tip. And again, I credit this book right here by Harold Davis for this next tip. And it's the concept of wabi-sabi. And that's basically, it's a Japanese concept that basically says that there is beauty in all stages of life, including the decline. So, as I mentioned, I had started introducing old barns in my landscape photography, and every so often I would sneak in and I'd find an old rusty truck on the side of the road and I'd take a picture of that, and that was kind of my guilty pleasure. I enjoyed doing that, but I thought, okay, I'm crazy for thinking that rust is beautiful. I'm crazy for thinking that a 40, 50-year-old truck derelict on the side of the road is something worth taking a picture of, but it appealed to me. And it wasn't until reading in this book about wabi-sabi and the fact that there is an entire movement behind seeing beauty in the decline, beauty in that transition, that made me think, okay, maybe there's something to this. Maybe it's not so weird that I find these things beautiful. And I started to kind of go off on a tangent, and within a few years, I started calling myself a decay photographer. I actually took more pictures of old rusted vehicles and, barns that are falling down than I did of the landscapes that drew me to photography in the first place. So that is a lot of how a photographer can transition, and I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable with those transitions. Don't lock yourself into something because you don't know what all is out there in photography. There are so many different genres of photography, so many ways you can utilize photography, and you can record beauty. And even if beauty is not your thing, maybe you want to record the ugly. And there is an argument to be made that decay photography is recording the ugly. But don't limit yourself. Allow yourself to gravitate to things that you like, even if you think it's not pure subject matter for photography. Who's to decide? You photograph what matters to you, and you will find an audience that your photography matters to. That I can assure you of. The last tip, this is number 5, and there's actually a bonus one that kind of applies to this as well, so stick with me to the end. This is one of those that I did learn early on, and I'm very glad that I did, because unlike the mistakes that I made with the tripods, getting the little cheap $20 Walmart tripods and then going up to a $30 Best Buy tripod and then going up to a $100 tripod that I got somewhere, I don't even remember where, I ended up spending a lot of money on cheap tripods that I could have just spent one time and gotten a tripod that realistically would have lasted me until now. The only reason that I'm on my second Manfrotto tripod is because I threw a temper tantrum about 2011 or so and just gave up on photography and sold all my equipment, and then 2 years later regretted that and went and rebought things. I don't recommend that you do that. Just put it in a closet for a little while, come back to it when you're ready. But anyway, I did go and rebuy the same tripod that I had before, the Manfrotto. It's a 3-section. The 055, I think, is the number on it. It's been redesigned since. Mine is still absolutely rock solid. I've had multiple times where it's been bumped and bruised, and you know it's good. But the lesson there is, buy it right the first time, and this really applies to lenses. This is tip number 5. Spend your money on glass. Don't worry about your camera body. Everybody worries about getting the next new and greatest thing, and every time they make a little small advancement, ooh, I have to have this. All the influencers online say, get this camera, get that camera. It has 30 frames per second as opposed to 25 frames per second. Who cares? Maybe the autofocus is 300th of a millisecond quicker. Who cares? You have 2 more stops of dynamic range. Who cares? Camera technology has plateaued for the most part. Anything over the last 10 years is essentially going to create a very high quality image. You don't need to stress camera bodies. Get a camera body that fits your hand, and one where the menus make sense and works for how you like to shoot. What I mean by that is, if you are going to shoot in one of the auto modes and you rarely go in and change a lot of stuff, get a basic camera. You don't have to spend the extra money, because the extra money for the enthusiast level and pro level cameras means that you have more buttons and controls to make things easier to access. That's the only difference, really. Build quality, weather resistance, that sort of thing. I think I just paused. Build quality, weather resistance, and that sort of thing will also factor into the pro and enthusiast bodies. But with lenses, there's usually 3 tiers. There's the kit lens, the one that is included in with the cheap camera body. There's a mid-level lens that usually has a fixed aperture but is not very fast, meaning that it's going to be like an f5.6 lens, maybe an f4. Then you get kind of the pro level lenses, and this is going to be that level of lens where you have weather sealing, really robust build quality, and you get faster glass, meaning f2.8 down to f1.0. So those things give you a lot more flexibility. And I'm not saying that you have to have fast glass, especially if you're a landscape photographer. You are very rarely going to shoot with a lens wide open or even remotely wide open. You can get away with an f4 lens as a landscape photographer all day, every day, because where you're going to spend your time is f8 and up to f16 or so, maybe even f22, f32 if you're using a long telephoto lens. But spend your money on lenses. The reason I say this is that is one of those, as long as you stay with the same brand of camera with the same mount, you're good. And then you can really adapt to different bodies if you need to. But you make a big purchase one time. You can get the little $100 Plastic Fantastic 50mm 1.8 and it's going to be a fair lens. It's not going to work fast. The autofocus is going to be kind of clunky on it. The manual focus has a wide swing. It may not be completely sharp. It may have this compromise, that compromise. But if you go ahead and spend 4 digits on a really high quality lens, that lens will outlast 4, 5, 6 bodies. I've still got the original EF lenses that I bought after my temper tantrum in 2013, and they all still work phenomenally well. I've got the 1635 f2.8 Mark II, the 2470 2.8 Mark II, and the 70 to 200 Mark II. It's f2.8 image stabilized. All of those were the ones that I bought after my temper tantrum to replace the exact same lenses that I had prior to. And those lenses still work fantastically today. I can adapt them to my R5 that I use for portrait work if I need to, but I use them exclusively in the field doing my landscape and decay. They work great with now on its second body, because I started with a 5D Mark III and then went with a 5 DSR. They would easily go multiple more bodies. However, Canon, just because of how things have shifted, has gone to mirrorless. So they're not making any more EF mount bodies, which is a shame. It really is. I really like shooting with a DSLR for a lot of different reasons. We'll talk about that at another time possibly. But the lenses are where it's worth spending the money. Don't skimp on those. Those have the most impact on contrast, color, sharpness, and character in your images. Get the lens that works best for what you do, how you shoot, and keep with it. Just stay with it. You don't need to change lenses. Lenses don't update significantly often. So you really aren't going to need to update your lenses. There's been version 3s of several of the lenses that I've got on the EF mount. I have no interest in getting the new ones. I don't need them. Everything that I've got works perfectly well for what I need, and it's because I bought it the way I did to save money over time. These lenses are 11 years old and they're flawless. Had I based everything on cheap lenses, I would have broken several of them by now. Some of them may have quit working. They wouldn't have provided me the flexibility that I needed. So I'm very glad that I spent the money where I did with lenses. And this goes along with filters as well. And I'm not going to try to sell anybody on any particular filter brand here. But just think, you spend $2,000 plus on a top quality lens, and then you put a $10 filter on it from Amazon. You are now shooting through a $10 filter. It doesn't matter what lens is behind there, because you are going to get distortion, you're going to get little anomalies, you're going to get flare, you're going to get all kinds of visual problems from that cheap filter. So if you're going to use filters, and I do highly recommend using filters, especially a polarizer, cannot be duplicated in post. But if you're going to use filters, don't cheap out there any more than you would cheap out on a lens, because this is going to be what determines your image quality. The camera body itself is always just going to be a light-proof box with a shutter control. So whatever camera body you've got sitting behind that lens, whether it be a beginner camera or a full-on pro-level magnesium-bodied Haas, what determines your image quality is going to be the glass that's in front of it, and ultimately the filter in front of said glass. So spend your money there. Don't cheap out. Put your money there. Camera bodies are disposable. They really are. They will go a very long time, and the pro level ones will last a lot longer than the beginner cameras. You get what you pay for to a point, but it's to a point of diminishing returns, and they are disposable. Get what works for how you shoot, where the buttons are, how they're accessed, how the menus work. But when it comes to getting legacy equipment, things that you're going to have for a very, very long time, that's your glass. Get glass that is the best you can afford for what you're shooting. For landscape stuff, I don't recommend needing a whole lot of really fast glass. You're not going to be shooting at that. So you don't need to fill a bag full of prime lenses that do f1.2 and f1.8. It's not needed. For landscape, an f2.8 is plenty fast, and there'll be a handful of times you might use 2.8, but most of the time you're going to be f8 to f16. Any lens can do that, but you want to make sure that you have a constant aperture, so as you're zooming in and out on a zoom lens, it doesn't change from f4 to f5.6 or f5.6 to 7.1. That becomes kind of problematic over time. So get a constant aperture, get one that's weather sealed if you shoot in various weather conditions, or if you shoot waterfalls and you get that water spray. You'll be surprised how wet a camera can get on a dry day shooting a waterfall if you're anywhere close to it. So spend the money there. So that's pretty much the 5 top tips that I would like to share with you. And just to review, my first top tip is don't discount being introduced to photography early on. Understand what brought you to photography. If it's the technical end, if it's the artistic end, things like that. Understand that part of it. Number 2, tripod is necessary for a lot of different types of photography and will make your learning photography a whole lot easier because you can make very small changes and see those changes. Number 3, landscape photos don't have to omit the hand of man. You can do a modern landscape that can include a cityscape, something with nothing but the hand of man in there. You can have a mixture. Whatever you want to shoot, if it's outside, I almost consider it a landscape, absent a portrait where the main purpose is shooting the person, not the scene. Number 4, understand the concept of wabi-sabi and decay, and don't limit yourself to there's only beauty in the spring, or there's only beautiful scenes in the fall with the colors. There's beauty at all stages of life from birth to death, everything in between. So don't limit yourself. And tip number 5, when it comes to spending your money, do it on glass and do it on the filters that go in front of that glass. And that will be an investment well worth your money. Don't change gear repeatedly. Every time a new manufacturer comes out with something, you don't have to go and rush over to Sony and then rush over to Nikon and then rush over to Canon just to go to Fuji. Stick with something. They're all excellent cameras at this point in time. Whatever route you go, you're fine. Go with what works for you. Stick with it. Learn to maximize what you've got. So that'll be a bonus tip. And I just want to thank everybody for joining me. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Next week I plan on coming back and talk about let's just put it this way, talk about a list of 5 things that I wish I had known starting out. These are things that I learned pretty early on. We're going to talk about 5 things I wish I knew. I think that's what we'll do. But at any rate, we'll be back here again next week, so I hope to see you there. And don't forget, like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. I'm never going to be a big channel, and that's okay, but I would like to reach as many people as I can that are benefited by hearing what I have to say. So thank you, and happy shooting, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.